Good morning. My name is Bruce Alexander. I'm the president and CEO of Vectra Bank, Colorado, and I'm just delighted to welcome you here today. I think it's wonderful how hardy Coloradoans are, that even with the snow and the sleet and whatever, that everybody got up so early to come learn about what the economic road ahead is. So we really appreciate you being here. We also want to thank our clients and colleagues across the state who are watching and participating in this event live on a webcast. So we're excited to be able to take this information really across the state of Colorado to our 40 offices all over the state. Before we get to our speakers, I'd like to take a minute to recognize the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation and the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce for their support in co-hosting this event for the past 22 years. A special welcome to Tom Clark and Kelly Bruff. And I saw Kelly over here. Kelly, will you stand up and say hello to the group? We really, let's give her a hand, yeah. We really appreciate their leadership for our city and our region, and they're a big part of our economic success. And they've also brought with them a number of their chamber and economic development partners from the surrounding region to join them today, and we appreciate your attendance as well. The title of our event this year is State of Change: Opportunities for Colorado's Businesses in 2015 and Beyond. This is a little bit different focus than what we've done in years past, where our speakers provided high-level perspectives on global, national, and regional topics. Today, our speakers will focus on a critical set of issues, including the demographic, economic, and industry trends that will likely have an impact on our businesses going forward. From the state's funding plans to support to continued economic growth, to the statistical trends that reflect the changing face of our population and workforce, our experts today will help us understand how all of these factors may affect each of our businesses in the next year. Clearly, Colorado's strengths and opportunities make us competitive nationally and internationally, but our speakers will also provide insight into the continued challenges and issues that merit further discussion and action from all of us as business and community leaders. Vectra Bank is proud to be a part of Colorado's thriving economy. Our portfolio remains strong and is growing. As part of our holding company, Zions Bank Corporation, we are among the top lenders to small business across the high-growth western states. At a time when regulation, legislation, and access to capital has changed how our industry works, we're proud that our consistency, creativity, and understanding of the Colorado economy has allowed us to be a leader in lending and customer service. And speaking of small business, I'd like to just introduce quickly the new district director of the Small Business Administration, who's just recently been appointed, Edward Cadena, who is here with us this morning. Edward, can you stand up and wave to everybody? He's in the back. The SBA is a great partner with all of us, trying to make sure that we have access to capital. Just as important as lending, Vectra Bank is committed to adding value to our customers and providing them with information and solutions to move our businesses forward. Our guest speakers this morning will certainly provide much fodder for discussion about what will be needed for our businesses to thrive in this new and changing environment. Elizabeth Garner, state demographer for Colorado, is going to launch our morning with a discussion about her current areas of research and some of the recent changes and trends she's seeing in our population. I think you're going to find this information incredibly interesting as you think about who are your customers of the future and who are your employees of the future. Patty Silverstein, chief economist for the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, who's one of our favorite speakers at this annual event and has been here for a long time, will bring us up to speed on the status of key economic indicators for the state and metro area regions. And our final speaker is new to our event this year, and we're so pleased that he could join us. Henry Sobenet is director of the Office of State Planning and Budgeting. He joins us today to discuss the variables that drive our state's economy, including the budget and other key economic factors. And I think Henry's one of the smartest people in Colorado, so we'll see how you feel when he's done, but he's one of those guys. So when our morning together closes, I hope you will have new information and insights to capitalize on all that 2015 has to offer. And as always, we'll make some time at the end for questions and answers. New this year, you can submit your question at any time using the QR code that's printed on your centerpieces. And to our webcast participants, you can also submit your question right on the webcast homepage at any time. So to kick off our morning is another new speaker to this event, Elizabeth Garner. Elizabeth is the state's demographer and joined the Colorado Department of Local Affairs in 2004. She's one of the best kept secrets in state government, I think. The State Demography Office not only provides population estimates, but also recently focused on the demographic trends and changes in our population and workforce. She'll help us better understand what these trends may mean for our business. Elizabeth is an economist by training and a Denver native. Please help me welcome Elizabeth to the podium.
Good morning. All right, demographics. Are you guys ready? You've never had to probably do this before at 8 a.m. or at 7:30 a.m. I've titled this presentation Transitions, primarily because of the demographic shifts that the state is going to be going through and basically already started probably in 2010 and the impacts that those are going to have on the state. These are the general topics that I'm going to be covering in terms of migration, growth in race and ethnicity, changes in age both at the young end and at the older end, growth in high end and low end services, growth in the changes in the labor force, and then what I call demographically challenged income, which I'll leave for the very end. Sometimes I think it's really important to know where does Colorado fit into the entire U.S. picture. And so if you look at the slide above, you'll see that the U.S. has been growing at about 0.7% per year. If we look at Colorado, right now about 5.3 million people, we're growing at about 1.5% per year, so about twice as fast as the U.S. as a whole. Compared then to other states, we're growing relatively fast, but I'll let you know that this is really not very different for the state. It's just in relative terms, we are growing faster than many. In the previous year, between 2012 and 2013, we increased by about 79,000 people, but ranked fifth fastest in absolute change behind some really heavy-hitting states, Texas, California, Florida, and North Carolina, which I think is really significant to show that Colorado can attract and retain population, which is a theme I'll come back to. However, if we look throughout the state, and I know that this is very Front Range centric, we can see that throughout the state that this is not the case. That the red, orange, yellow states are those, counties, red, orange, yellow counties are those that have been increasing in population, and the shades of blue have not. And so you can see the western slope, a lot of the eastern plains, especially the southeast part of the state, have been declining in population while we've been one of the fastest growing states in the U.S. And I think that that's an important factor to take into consideration because we are a sum of our pieces. When we change in population, there's two primary components. One is called natural increase, which is births minus deaths. The other piece is net migration. And this slide shows the relationship between net migration and job change. Job change are the blue bars, net migration is the red line. And so we can see that there's a high correlation between the number of jobs generated and the migration to the state. When we migrate people to the state, and this is maybe the most favorite graph I've ever made, and I make hundreds of them, it shows migration by age to the state, and what we can see is who do we attract? We attract youngins, primarily between the ages of about 23 and 37 is our peak attractive age to the state. Now, I'll let you know that every county is very different, so if you've got clients or business in other counties, you can come to our website and see the changes, but this is not just current. This has been our historical trend, so I want you to think back, maybe many of you, when did you migrate to the state? Because I will tell you only 42% of us are natives. So that means a lot of you out there are probably non-natives and migrated here, and what age did you migrate? So taking into account economic forecasts and our demographic forecasts and looking at aging and race and ethnicity, our forecast for the state is to increase from about 5.3 million current to about 7.8 million by 2040. The blue component of these charts shows that growth in the Front Range, followed by the red, which we are seeing as a growth is in the western slope. However, if we look at it by county throughout the state, and it's kind of in a 3D raised, the darkest colors are the counties that are forecast to increase the fastest or by the most amount of people, with the flattest colors being slow growth. So if the state's forecast to increase by about 2.7 million between 2010 and 2040, about 2.1 of that is in the Front Range, about 1.2 in the Denver metro area, with about 500,000 in the North Front Range and about 400,000 in the south part of the Front Range, with the remaining 600,000 spread throughout the rest of the counties. We're also changing by race and ethnicity, and that is a huge transition for us. If we look at the chart, the bottom bar is 1970, where about 85% of the population was white, non-Hispanic, about 10% Hispanic, and the rest, all other race ethnic groups. By 2010, that shifted to about 70% white, non-Hispanic, about 20% Hispanic. By 2040, we're forecasting it to be about 55% white non-Hispanic, about 33% Hispanic. And that's a significant change because that is our market. That is who we're going to be selling our products and services to over the next 2 decades. And so we need to think about how is that transitioning. But maybe most importantly is knowing that there's a significant difference by age. These charts showing at the far left is less than 5. With the far right, over 65, again, the blue is white non-Hispanic, and we can see that our race ethnic composition is definitely very different by age group. If we look at the youngest ages, it's already about 33% Hispanic. So we're not really forecasting a significant change at the youngest ends, but where we are seeing that change is basically from over 18 all the way up to 65 over the next several decades. But this is the population that's going to be buying homes, in your labor force, buying our goods and services. So again, it's an important transition that the state is going through. The next piece is, dang, we're getting old. And we're getting old really fast. But you know why we're getting old really fast? Because we're young. And you're like, what? I didn't have enough coffee. But we are getting old really fast because we're young, because who do we migrate? Youngins. When did we have our first set of youngins move to the state? In the 70s. And I bet many of you could raise your hand and say, yeah, that was me. And therefore, if we migrate youngins, how long does it take to them to be turned 65 plus? Oh, about 30, 40 years. So between 1970 and current, we've been growing this working class population. Now by 2010, our leading age of baby boomers is entering that 65 plus. So we've got a lot of boomers, about 1.3 million of them. Colorado's 65 plus population's forecast to increase by about 125%, increasing from the 555,000 to 1.2 million by 2030, just from aging. You saw in that migration by age chart, we don't migrate a lot of people that are over 65. We primarily migrate youngins. So that's a significant shift for us. Are we all of a sudden going to become an old state? Nah. You know why? We migrate youngins. Because if we didn't, then we would become old. But we're not, because we migrate youngins. This is my second favorite chart I've ever made. And this is significant, showing the age change. So it's population by age. So age is along the horizontal axis and vertical axis is total population. And we can see in 1990, which is the red shape, our population. And we can see those baby boomers entering our primary age for the working population. The difference between the green and the red is where our age changed between 1990 and 2010. And we can see the biggest change was in the 45 to 64-year-olds. And I want you to think about that age group and think about who was your market and what was growing really fast between 1990 and 2010. I also want you to note that there was very little change in the 65 plus. So if you look at the red line or the black line there, that's at 65, and we can see that difference between the red and the green at that 65 plus, and there was very little change. Then we bring in the blue part. That's 2030. So we can see where we're going to be changing in age over the next decades. And it's primarily at the 65 plus, but also in the younger ages. So when I told you at the very beginning, I said we're going to be getting older and younger at the same time. And that's exactly what I mean, but you see very little change in the 45 to 64-year-olds. And I want you to think about that in terms of your market. So when are we getting oldest fastest? Right now. Right now, between 2010 and 2020 is our fastest growing time period in the over 65 population, increasing by 60% between 2010 and 2020. Oh, we're already at 2015, we're halfway there. Increasing by 60%. That means 6% per year. How fast is the state growing? 1.5. So our 65 plus population is increasing 4 times as fast as our total population. Since when has your market increased by 6% per year, or 60% over a decade? So there's several factors that are affected by the aging in the population, and these are just to name a few. The ones that I want to focus on are, there we go. The economy and the labor force. The economy, very briefly. Think about this. Spending of people over the age 65 support a quarter of a job per person over the age 65. Now I want you to think about, where do they buy their goods and services? Oh, they're primarily a service-oriented age group. Healthcare, eating out, traveling, and I don't want to generalize. I know a lot of you are saying, I don't do that. And that's fine, but they're not your goods buying age group as other age groups are. And that's going to be a significant transition in our economy. The second piece is your labor force. Your labor force in 2010 was about 37% baby boomers. And yes, we know that they're staying in the labor force longer because they want to or they have to. And I'm going to tell you, it's better for our economy if they do stay in the labor force. As income earners, they make much bigger impact as an earner than as they do as a retiree. A lot of people think, won't those boomers just get out of the way and let the millennials come in? Actually, there's a lot of research showing that there is more of an economic impact boom benefit from them staying in the labor force rather than leaving. But over the next 20 years, whether we like it or not, about 1 million of us are going to be aging out of the labor force. And that's going to be a significant impact on the demand for labor force, because this is going to be our fastest growing time period of leavers from the labor force. If you go back to that second favorite graph of the different colors, we have never had a growth in that 65 plus population like we're going to face right now. Our increase of leavers is going to be increasing by over 60%, meaning that the demand for workers is not only created by a new job being created, but also by somebody leaving the labor force. So think about that in terms of, who are you going to be hiring? Are we going to be able to attract the best and the brightest? So there's several factors going to be tightening your labor force that I want you to be thinking about. One, female share of the labor force peaked in 2010, so we can't get any additional kind of bang for our buck with women entering the labor force because we reached our peak in 2010. Structurally, due to our age distribution, we also reached our peak labor force participation rate in 2010 just by age. We've got this growth in leavers, and there's fewer Gen Xers. At first, we were called the baby bust. Now they call us Gen X. Don't know why. But there's fewer of us to bring in those lead positions in your office. And then we've had high and underemployment for the youngins. So they didn't get that first job. They've maybe been a barista for the last couple of years. They haven't been in maybe management positions. So you, as business owners, also have a big responsibility of moving between the boomer and the millennial. And how do you provide the training and education that they may need? I'm not going to go through this one in great deal, but a lot of people ask me, this gives the total population by generation over time. The only thing I want to say is that in 2015, millennials now have exceeded boomers in the state as a whole. And that's maybe a significant transition point in our history as a state. The last piece I'm going to be talking about here is kind of public finance and looking at share of the total economy. And it's going to go back to a couple of slides that I've talked about. I want you to look at the purple line. That's our share of the total population by age group for the 45 to 64-year-olds. Between 1990 and 2010, that age group was a growing share of our economy. And I want you to think about who they were. Oh, they were your highest earning age group. Oh, your highest spending age group. Oh, your highest property tax spending age group. And what do we see from 2010 forward? Oh, declining as a share of our total state economy, our state population. Between 2010 and 2030, what do we see start growing as a share of our economy? Oh, the 65 plus. Lowest income earning, lowest spending on goods, lowest spending on property tax. Significant transition in our economy. So as I had mentioned, I'm going to leave the demographically challenged income to the very end, and I will leave it with that. One, we've basically had this demographic dividend from 1990 through 2010 when we had the growing share of our economy, or growing share of our age group was the 45 to 64-year-olds. And that has changed. Because of our age distribution, our occupational mix is going to be changing, growing a lot more at the high end and low end service, creating more bifurcation within our economy. And that's going to create some challenges. The change in race ethnic makeup is going to be changing, and the only question I have is, can we make some significant progress in the achievement gap by education to make sure that our young generations coming up are the best and the brightest? Household type is smaller and often single, so that in fact impacts housing unit type and cost. And then finally, that youth and underemployment. Significant impact this last decade on our youngest group of workers. And the big question for many people is, will they ever be able to reach what their parents attained? Because they missed an important part of their education in terms of in the workforce. So I will just end things now and just think about Colorado. It has been able to attract the best and the brightest. It's one of the faster growing states. We know that people want to come here. Patty and Henry will both talk about our economic situation, which is very positive. My question for all of you is, will we continue to be able to attract the best and the brightest? Because we know that that's an important piece. We know that we're going to be having this growth in high and low end. How do we manage that going into the future? How do we manage the disparate growth across the state? So I want to thank you all very much for inviting me to be here. I'm very honored to be a part of your session. Demographers don't really ever get to do these kinds of things. We're usually stuck in the office somewhere. But thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I told you demographers were cool, right? And you just think about how thought-provoking what she just said means to the future of our state, the future of our businesses. And I think all of us, as we've learned over the past economic difficult times of the past 5 years, we all need to learn to reinvent ourselves. And I think that's true in our personal lives, our business lives, and certainly in our state of Colorado. So good stuff. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Over the history of Vectra Bank Colorado, we've been proud to support local organizations doing good things in the community. At our economic events, we started a tradition of making donations in lieu of silly giveaway items. So today we're pleased to recognize yet another prominent nonprofit we're fortunate to have in our community. Young American Center for Financial Education. Young Americans Center for Financial Education is home to Young Americans Bank and an incredible array of award-winning nonprofit programs, all designed to teach young people about finances, economics, and business. Since opening their doors in 1987, they've served more than 500,000 youth throughout Colorado and surrounding states. We welcome Rich Martinez, CEO and President of Young American Center for Financial Education, as well as members of the Youth Advisory Board and members of the Board of Directors of Young Americans with us today. Vectra is pleased to honor you with a $5,000 donation this year, and all of us would like to recognize the wonderful work you do. Rich, would you come up and get your check, please? And I think especially with what we learned this morning about the changing age of our state, the work you guys do is even more important. So we appreciate that very much. I'm now very happy to introduce you to Patty Silverstein. Well-versed on the local economy, Patty is consulting chief economist for the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, author of the Chamber's monthly Economic and Indicators Report, and if you don't get that, you should get it. I get it every month, and it's just a really cool program, and we look at our business planning in great part based upon the data that we get from Patty. She's also president of Development Research Partners, a real estate analysis and economic development research company. We're also honored that she has become a staple of Vectra's annual economic event. Please help me welcome Patty.
Good morning. Did everybody have a good year last year? Are you looking forward to an even better year this year? Really? Nobody is? Come on. Okay, I'll tell you what kind of a good year you'll be looking forward to. How about that? So Elizabeth has already kicked this off talking about all of our changing faces. So this is my favorite chart that her entity does because, and I stole it from them, admittedly. But this shows now, we're going to zoom into what's going on within the Metro Denver area. And by Metro Denver, I'm talking about Douglas County on the south, all the way up into Boulder and Adams counties on the north. So this now takes a look at our population in the Metro Denver region by these various age groups or by these various generational groups. And so again, you can see, what this looks at 2015. Notice that Metro Denver has a younger population than the state as a whole. So actually, millennials became the largest generational group here in the Metro Denver region before they did at the whole state level. So we've had a few years of already dealing with millennials being kind of the largest group here. They're shown in the red. And I want you to focus on the group that is in between the black bars. That's our potential labor force. So a lot of the millennials still very young, still in school, wrapping up their education, but we also see the baby boomers now starting to move out of retirement. Notice that blue group is called I have it labeled just the next generation. They don't have a name yet. The Pew Research Center is the one that usually comes up with all the fancy names for the generational groups, and our next generation doesn't have a name yet. Some people are calling them Gen Z. I've heard them called Gen We, like the gamers. I love that one. I think that's great. So we'll see whether that sticks or exactly where we end up. So this is current. Fast forward now to 10 years from now. And you will see that the millennials are very solidly now the bulk of our labor force. The boomers have been moving out of the labor force. There are all those purple bars. We're all now enjoying traveling and restaurants and kind of everything that Elizabeth mentioned there. So in 10 short years, we do go through this whole major demographic shift. So what does this mean then for our workers here? Or our companies here? So just kind of a few kind of fun facts or fun tidbits about these whole changing demographic groups here. So first of all, our millennials are on track to be the most educated generation in our history. Now, as business owners, we know we want those best, those brightest. So the good news is that you're going to have this group of very highly educated to attract then to your companies. But notice also we're having this increase in contingent employment. This is temporary workers, freelancers, consultants. What we're seeing out there is this whole transition on both sides, both the boomers as well as the millennials, of looking for flexibility in their work schedules, of being able to work on the projects that they want to, of finding meaningful type of work. So kind of this whole temporary type of attitude as well. Notice also the increase in telecommuting. They want the flexibility to be able to work at home sometimes, or to be able to work in different locations, that type of thing. And very interested in entrepreneurship. So for companies now, as we're looking forward, in the Metro Denver region, we're expected to average an unemployment rate of 4% in 2015. 4%. Now, if you think back to your days in Econ 101, because I'm sure all of you took that class, you will find that that natural rate of unemployment, there's still a lot of debate about what that is, but it's 4.5%, 5%. So we're going to be operating in an economy then where it's going to be a very tight labor market. So it's really going to behoove our companies, excuse me, to think about how do I get these workers? How do I keep these workers? How do I retain these workers? Because it's going to be a very competitive environment out there. So we're continuing to grow. We're continuing to expand. Our employment has been growing at about a 3.2% rate in Metro Denver in 2014. And it will expand by about 3% in 2015. So what this means is that we're adding roughly 45,000 workers in last year and this year. So a nice surge in employment here. As we take a look, though, those numbers that we look at in terms, when we talk about employment growth rates, remember, they don't include a huge component of our economy, which is our sole proprietors. Those numbers, those employment growth numbers, don't generally include those folks. And this is a really important part of our economy. And remember, too, that we have a lot of interest. These millennials that are moving here in droves are very interested in entrepreneurship. Colorado ranks as the fourth ranks number 4 when it comes to concentration of these sole proprietors. We look at the first state, or the number 1 state in terms of that whole concentration of proprietors, as being, yes, Kelly Bruff's home state, Montana. And when we think about this again, when we take a look at all across the country, and why do these proprietors move? Why do these entrepreneurs go to these areas? Again, I think it becomes very important to be taking a look at the quality of life. These are independent thinkers. They are moving according to where they see opportunities. And so maintaining the quality of life and the advantages here in Colorado helps us to attract and retain all of these really best and brightest when it comes to the entrepreneurial area. So we're growing, going to be adding about 45,000 jobs. What industries are we expecting to see some of this growth in? So as our economic development strategy, the Metro Denver Economic Development Corp focuses on 8 key industry clusters. These are the key industries that, as these industries start to expand, it lifts the entire economy. As we start to see expansion in these industries, we start to see expansion in construction activity and retail activity and all of those various industries. These are our primary employers. And one of the fun ways to take a look at this is through our bubble chart. So on this bubble chart, we are taking a look at all of our clusters and our subclusters. Subclusters denoted by the same color of the bubble there. Along the bottom graph, or the bottom axis, then, we're looking at the growth rate. So notice that our fastest growing industry in 2014, of our fastest growing industry clusters, was energy. And by that, I'm taking a look at both clean tech, that renewable energy side, as well as the fossil fuel side, all the oil and gas. So remember, most of the data that we've been taking a look at for Metro Denver is a 7-county. When we take a look at our industry clusters, we're actually looking at 9-county. So we're pulling in Weld and Larimer County into this whole discussion as well, hence the very fast growth in the oil and gas that we have seen. Now, little concern as we move forward into 2015 of what does this mean that our gasoline prices are declining like this? So even as we do our happy dances as we fill up our gas tanks, because we all do these days, right? we're still a little concerned that there are areas of the country where these falling prices are not necessarily a benefit. In those areas of the country where they're not necessarily as much of a benefit can be right here in Colorado or in any of those major oil-producing states. So we're looking at that as kind of slowing our growth a little bit, but certainly not putting a halt to our growth by any stretch of the imagination here in the Metro Denver region. So nonetheless, you could still do your happy dance when you fill up your gas tank, but do recognize that it does mean that our job growth will not be as rapid in 2015 as it would be if we continued to see the expansion in drilling activity and that type of thing. I should mention too that as far as those industry cluster reports, they were just released. All the 2014 reports were just released last week. You can get all that 10, 20-page information on each of our industry clusters for free at metrodenver.org. So I encourage you that if you're really focused on any of those industries, learn about the trends, learn about what is going on within those various industry groups. Because I could talk for hours about that, but we have lots of other things to cover. So I want to move on forward. And now I want to talk about commercial real estate, because as we see this whole expansion then in employment, we're starting to see more of our commercial real estate space being occupied. So all throughout 2014, we saw vacancy rates going down. We saw lease rates going up. In fact, we are now at historic lows when it comes to our industrial market. Why do we have such a low vacancy rate on industrial? Everybody's thinking, I know you're thinking it's the grow operations, But we're actually seeing a resurgence in industrial all across the country, and it's not just the grow operations here. We have an expansion in manufacturing. In the Metro Denver region, this is so exciting. So our manufacturers are taking up more of that space. We're also seeing more of the warehouse and distribution space being taken up as companies are trying to get their little Amazon drones to deliver things. So certainly what we see with the expansion of some of the grow operations is making it more challenging for some of the companies, but that's not the only reason that industrial has indeed been expanding. So when we take a look then, because of these very low vacancy rates, we're seeing new construction all around. And some of this new construction then at very high levels on the industrial market and speculative industrial buildings. Oh my golly, did you think we would see the day on that once again? And so certainly lots of industrial construction underway, lots of office space underway, a lot of that office space being kind of centered right here in the downtown Denver region. On the retail side, not as much development. In fact, that's really more where we're seeing redevelopment type of activities. And another big influence from the construction side is infrastructure. So soon, we are going to be able to take fast tracks all around the Metro Denver area. How cool is that? And so we had, the West Line that came online last year, and now we have the Gold, the I-225, the East Line, the US 36, Best Rapid Transit Corridor, all coming on board by 2016, North Metro by 2018. We're building out this whole system. We're doing all of this expansion out at DIA. So mobility throughout the Metro Denver region so greatly enhanced and definitely changing our development patterns. The big question that remains out there, what in the world are we going to do with I-70? How can we get people from Denver International Airport up to the Vail area in an easy, efficient manner where you don't have to spend hours and hours upon the road? And I think that really is one of the greatest challenges then that we as a community are facing right now. So let's focus on all these changing demographics too as far as how they influence where we are living. So with, millennials on target to be the most educated generation in history, student loan debt is definitely accumulating here. So their credit score is a little bit lower and all too, and so they're a little bit challenged when it comes to purchasing some new homes. So the millennials have actually been living in our basements yet, right? So in 2012, 36% of our millennials were still living in their parents' home. Now, some of the millennials at this point, they were young. They were supposed to be there. there living in our homes. But of those that really should be out moving out on their own, we're seeing definitely a delay in that type of patterns. Now, we're also seeing that the younger buyers, when they move into the market, are actually buying a lot of the older homes. So case in point, my backyard neighbors have this, my neighborhood is 30, 40 years old there. Young couple went in, bought this house, just really scraped the entire insides of this. They redid everything. And I'm like, wow, how did you guys learn how to do this? And evidently, you can learn how to do anything by watching YouTube. So they are figuring out how to redecorate, redesign, reuse, repurpose by all of, in their purchasing patterns and in their housing patterns there. So with all of that, then, we're seeing some consistent sales patterns, I would say. I mean, we're seeing that our home sales activity is really at about our historic norms given the size of our marketplace. So just a 0.1 increase that we had in 2014, half a percentage point increase in 2015. Again, a good, reasonable level of activity given the size of our market. But our market, I would suggest, is also pretty constrained by the fact that even if you want to buy a home, it is hard to find those homes. So throughout this entire metropolitan region, 3 million people strong here, we had 4,300 homes on the market in December. That's it, 4,300 homes. This is down by 45% from just a year ago. So definitely a very challenging market out there. And that is then leading to these very high home prices. So when we take a look at median home prices, notice first of all that in the Denver metro region, we surpassed $300,000 in terms of our median home price for the first time in 2014. And indeed, we expect that we're going to be knocking up to about $325,000 for our median home price in 2015. Notice also that gap between Metro Denver and the US is getting wider. So again, we are perceived as a very expensive housing market. That's a challenge from the economic development side when these companies are looking to grow and expand. Can their employees afford to live here? I would also add that, so this looks at the Denver MSA. If I were to put Boulder on the graph here too, the Boulder median home price up to $436,000. Ouch. So because of that, we're seeing a lot of interest in apartments. So if I can't afford to buy a home, I'm going to instead just rent the space there. And so certainly our apartment vacancy rate has been staying very low, but that apartment lease rate has also been increasing now, up to $1,169 in the fourth quarter of 2014. That was our average lease rate, up 12% over the year. So many of these folks, too, are looking at this saying, can I just kind of throw all that money out the window in terms of rent, or should I put it into an ownership position? And it's a tough balancing act right now. So one of the things that what we're seeing now in the market and responding to these very low vacancy rates, high sales activity, is a lot of new residential construction. Yay! Remember a few years ago when I stood up here, Bruce, and it was like I was apologizing because there was nothing going on in terms of new activity there for folks that are in the development markets. But now we're definitely seeing expansion. Notice that most of the half of the construction, I should say, is multifamily. That means we're looking at higher density opportunities here. And it's because of, again, at the different age groups, we have the millennials that are interested in higher density. We have the boomers that are interested in higher density because they want lower maintenance types of opportunities. So we're at 50% now of development. Our historic norm is 25%. And some people have expressed some concern of, are we overbuilding? But remember, we have fast tracks coming. We have this new opportunity for transit-oriented development and new density that we did not have in prior years. So this has really been a great response to the market and providing some opportunities then for our folks to live and work here in the Metro Denver region. So with that, thank you so much. Have a fabulous 2015. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
I always love Patty's enthusiasm, but I always get conflicted because I don't know whether to feel good because the economy is so great or bad because you can't find a home and you can't find employees. So challenges, I think, ahead for all of us. Those of you who are bankers in the room, if you saw her clusters chart, did you notice that financial services types were sort of at the bottom? Not a lot of job growth there. So baristas, is that the new future for bankers? I'm not sure, but we're going to invest in YouTube. Can you learn banking on YouTube too? I don't know. We'll find out. Anyway, thank you, Patty. That was awesome, as always. Before we call up our final speaker, we'd like to honor the winner of our annual prediction survey. After each one of our forecast breakfasts, we send a survey to attendees asking for their predictions on things like the stock market, unemployment, and mortgage rates. And this next one, we're going to also ask about what we should name the next generation. I think that would be a good one, too. Just over 70% of those who responded were right on the mark when you predicted that the Dow would close above 15,000 to end the year of 2014. Unfortunately, that's where our attendees' prognostication skills ended. Only 4 people predicted correctly that Colorado unemployment rate would fall below 5%. It was actually 4.1% at the end of November, and that mortgage rates would stay below 4%, which came in at 3.99 at the end of the year. Actually, the most disappointing statistic is that a third of our respondents didn't put their names on the survey, so I know you're smart, but you're not that smart. And actually, a lot of those people had all the right answers, so pay attention to the detail when you fill out the survey this time. Fortunately, one of the respondents fared better as a lay economist and actually gave us his name. Please help me congratulate our winner, Frank Shushat. Unfortunately, Frank can't be with us this morning, but we'll make sure that we deliver his $100 gift card to him later. This year's survey will be in your email inboxes later this morning, so please look for us and send us your predictions for the coming year. Also, please take a moment to provide us with your feedback on this event. We are doing things a little bit differently this year, and we really want to hear what kind of information you'd like to have going forward, because we hope this is relevant not only to yourselves, your businesses, but also to how we participate as citizens in the future of the state economy. So now I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Henry Sobanet. Henry began working at the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budgeting in 1999 as Deputy Director. And in September 2004, Governor Owens appointed him as Director. After leaving office to serve as President of Colorado Strategies, LLC for many years, Governor Hickenlooper selected Henry to return as Director of the Office of State Planning and Budgeting in 2011. Over the years, he's researched, developed, and negotiated several innovative plans to address state budget issues, some of which we'll hear about this morning. His information is really important to how all of us look at the future of our state. Please welcome Henry Sobanet.
Good morning. You are stalwarts, 3 PowerPoints, 3 economists. But Bruce provided the bacon, so I appreciate being here. It's quite an honor. I've been in the audience many times, and so it's a little bit like a dream. Oh my God, I got called up to the stage. So thank you for including me and all the work your team does to put on this event. It's truly a lot of work. A little bit on the economy today, and then a little bit about how our state budget works. Where do your income and sales taxes go? What's the outlook for our very complicated rules-based system? I will warn you, going into the remarks today, you're going to experience cognitive dissonance. That's going to require you to hold 2 completely different opposite ideas in your head at the same time, because that's the system we have in our Constitution, which governs a lot of our revenue and a lot of our spending. So briefly, just the bird's eye view that we take at the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, because we have to forecast statewide tax revenue. This is jobs in Colorado versus the country, standardized to the same index so we can look at them at the same time. No surprise to anyone in this room, we have been outperforming the national economy for a long time, and even the slope of the line is even better than the national economy. We recovered the jobs that we lost quicker, and we're growing faster. A couple of dark clouds on the horizon, kind of with the oil and gas situation, and we're trying to monitor that. I think we're in the early stages of making a reasonable prediction. But otherwise, the remarks you've heard so far today is the most reasonable expectation, as far as economists can do, is for continued growth. Momentum is a real thing, and it would take, a shock that we can't perceive right now to slow it down. Our prior two speakers alluded to this a little bit. The growth in the state has not been uniform, and if you can't see all the way in the back, on the far left is Greeley. We have the kind of regional growth here, 28.2% from January 2010 to November of last year. Obviously, the oil and gas development is reflected there. Denver's next along the line, a little bit above the statewide average. Same with Fort Collins and Loveland. Boulder also right in the mix there. But now we have these different regions kind of out of the metro area where we don't see the same kind of growth, and it's really not for the same reason. This has been a big topic in public policy the last couple of years. What can we do to stimulate, to create the right set of circumstances so that these lagging areas can enjoy similar rates of growth to the average that we see in the state? So Colorado Springs, a set of circumstances there mostly related to federal spending and also some pullbacks in technology. Grand Junction, several years ago, it was boomtown when natural gas prices were very high going in ahead of the Great Recession, and then a big pullback as prices fell. And so this bounce back period is protracted. So we are talking a lot now at the policy level. What are the things we can do when you can't just say, hey, oil and gas industry, get back to work? It just doesn't work that way. So what other things can replace that lost activity? Similarly, in Pueblo, we have a lot of large employer risk, and we've had some pullbacks in some large employers there. Also demographic issues similar to how Elizabeth was discussing, the average age. So a lot of factors contributing to Pueblo being at not near the average there. So just for some perspective, top of mind things, this is gas prices at the national level adjusted for inflation as well as our current price right now. And so, we have seen gas prices this low before, especially adjusted for inflation. But what we are now trying to gauge is, okay, we saw a lot of economic activity that was a result of higher oil prices, advances in technology. Now we have a disruption that's a little bit out of our control. Even are the Saudis trying to get back at Russia for helping the Syrians? And so, geopolitical issues that, are very hard to put into a statistical model. So what are the impacts of this drop? How long will the drop be? Again, though we've seen prices this low before and even lower, we don't know the impact yet in Colorado in full measure. We will see some drop off. Okay, so not only do we get to be wrong on our forecasts, we get to be wrong on forecasting state revenue. And so what we have here is going back the same period from the employment slide that you saw at the beginning. So the end of the dot-com, and then a deep recession. The middle part of the 2000s, we had a recovery, and then the Great Recession, another 2 down years in general fund revenue. Remember, general fund revenue, income and sales taxes. If I say general fund, it's the income and sales taxes that you pay to the state of Colorado. But now we're on the far right of this slide. Remarkable bounce back. As we know, we're outpacing the country, but the state has been growing. Demands on the state have been growing. Inflation's continued. So the dotted line that you see is if we take the amount of money that we had right before the Great Recession and adjust for population and inflation, our purchasing power is slightly down, about even, but a little bit down. Not a complaint. We are able to restore budgets. We're able to make much more satisfactory choices than in the middle part of the slide there. But in terms of Colorado being a growing state and how deep the last 2 recessions were, the purchasing power is just not the same. So we collect money and we put it to use. So this is our pie chart of where we spend general fund. But let me turn this more into more everyday language. The big slice, K-12 education, this helps pay for about 850,000 kids to go to public school. We pay whatever the local share of property taxes don't pay. There's some complicated rules that go along with that. We'll get into that in just a second. In the higher education slice, there are about 150,000 resident full-time equivalent students in all the schools that are state schools and community colleges around the state. Corrections and public safety, we have a court system, judicial districts all over the state, and we have a correction system. Almost 21,000 inmates are under our supervision right now. And then Health and Human Services, the 2/3 of that slice is the state Medicaid program, and about 1 million people in Colorado receive health care through that program. So pretty dry pie slice, I can imagine, but hopefully those statistics give you a little bit of sense of what we are responsible for at the state level. What we're now facing, though, is we can't even keep the amount of money that we have. We have a complicated system of tax and spending rules, and so Bruce said, I love your talks, but can you please make it relatable? And so what we've tried to come up with here is TABOR Simile. TABOR is like a bucket. And so all the money that we collect in the state is subject to this law called TABOR, the Taxpayers Bill of Rights. And we have a cap. The amount we can keep goes up by inflation and population. So all the money comes into a bucket. The cap is basically the spigot, and the spigot can go up the side of the bucket by inflation plus population. So into the bucket, we get income and sales taxes, which we just talked about, and then we also have cash funds. Not all of our cash funds contribute to this orange section, but things like transportation fees, the professional fees you pay to Department of Regulatory Agencies, et cetera. We've exempted so many, I'm losing track of the ones in and out. But the orange money is basically fees that people pay that still count towards TABOR. Blue is general fund. When water gets up to the spigot, it spills out. And because of quirks in the law, and especially laws that govern how the cash fund money comes in, only general fund money pays the rebate. So, from the slide before, you saw a little slice coming in of TABOR refunds. And so even though we've had some pretty significant cash fund growth over the last 5 to 7 years, and it's contributing to this total, the general fund has to pick up the liability when the water gets up to the limit. I went to the Water Congress last week and I said, this slide is drier than the last one. And they groaned. So this is another way of thinking about the bucket. The bars, the yellow bars, is the combined water in the bucket, and the line at the top is the spigot. So as you can see now, we're above the cap. We're in the third one from the right. That's the fiscal year we're in now. We expect to be a little bit above the cap this year, and similarly for the next 2 years. And those refunds are going to come out of our general fund. So the money that we use for education, for healthcare, to support higher education, that's now getting crowded out by this limit in the Constitution. What is not included here, if you've been following closely, is there's a separate little tiny issue with the marijuana taxes that were increased with Proposition AA. There's another quirk in TABOR. We're going to be probably back to the voters this November to confirm the vote to tax marijuana. Otherwise, we have to give back all the tax money that we've collected so far. So we're earmarking that off to the side. It's not reflected in this chart. And more to come on that, I'm sure, but there will be a referred measure to vote a second time to keep that money. Okay, so we're going to do a couple deep dives into the two biggest budgets in the general fund, K-12 education and Medicaid. I said earlier that we fund about 850,000 kids out of the general fund, and we pay what doesn't get generated by local share property taxes. So what you have here in the stacked bar is all the money that goes to school finance by the sources of funds. And so the yellow section is mostly local property taxes. And you can see going along to the right as we go forward from fiscal year 12, the impact of lower residential property values. Residential property taxes were pretty flat for several years, and finally now we're getting to see some growth. The blue and the green are state sources of funds that come out of the general fund. And so what we've actually budgeted and actually appropriated to K-12 education is in the stacked bar. There's a law in the Constitution called Amendment 23, adopted by the voters in year 2000. And what that said is we want spending from the state level on K-12 education to grow by a certain factor, even if you don't have sufficient revenue to meet the target. Yes, the voters said yes. And so the black line reflects that target. During the depth of the recession, the Great Recession, the state reanalyzed the language of the law and found that though there had been this target set, the actual law required only, basically said that there could be some relief for meeting that target. As you can imagine, the proponents of the law didn't take kindly to that, and we're in court over that. So I'm calling it the Amendment 23 target as opposed to requirement for that issue. So the gap between the black line and the stacked bar, if you follow this issue closely, is called the negative factor. And so for some reason, the state decided, this was while I was out in exile, minding my own business, the state decided to keep track of how much we aren't funding K-12 education. Could you imagine a list at home of all the chores you haven't completed for your spouse, and you just handed it over each dinner? That's the negative factor in the state budget. Here's how we are hurting you on a yearly basis. So this negative factor is about $900 million. And it can max out at about $1.4 billion. And that's around 2 years of growth in that formula of inflation and enrollment growing every year. We've never really seen that combined index drop in the state. Now, what's important about this slide is the last two bars, and it's the change in the amount in green from one year to the next. The blue slice has been this one-time source of funds that we've been saving off to the side to help pay for this formula, at least to the extent we can. But it's one-time money. When we had surplus funds the last couple of years, we put that in there and we've been drawing it down. We have a proposal to even put some more one-time money into the K-12 system. And so the dynamic I'm explaining to you now is actually probably accelerated by 1 year. But it's really, this is going to happen. This is not forecast error. This is formulas playing out. The difference in the green from the budget year that we're proposing and the one right after it that will start to work next summer is $544 million of general fund money to keep this negative factor, this list of chores that we haven't completed, at the same level. No new chores added to the list. $544 million is more money than we will collect in the entire general fund for the entire pie slices. So the formula, something will give. And what we're trying to go around the state, and we really do thank Bruce for the chance to come talk, is by formula, by vote of the people a long time ago, we are going to have a cap on the amount of money that we can keep, and we're going to spend money that we don't have. There will be absurd results. And before these absurd results occur, the lawyers in the room know what I'm talking about, we want to kind of run around and talk to people and say, are you sure? Is this the vision you had for the state? Now, Medicaid, big slice of the pie, about 25% of the general fund. If you qualify for the program, you are in the program. And if every dollar we spend in the program, in most cases, gets matched by another federal dollar. And so we pay for very interesting, discrete categories here. It's mostly poverty, but also age and disability. And so the thing to focus on is down at the bottom, we can see the proportion of caseload here, and the light blue is elderly and persons with disabilities. And then you go over and you can see what share of the total cost do they comprise. So 11% of our caseload is elderly and disabled, but that's 35% of our cost mix. Now, the reason Bruce wanted demographers here to talk about budgets is right now we're talking about all the people who are turning 65. And I hope one day to be 65, and it's not that old. You're even younger than the drummer for the Rolling Stones if you're 65 years old. The real problem is when the 65-year-olds turn 80. And this big acceleration where the share of the population basically from 2010 to 25, that's 65 and over, is going to double. 15 years after that acceleration, we're at the mix right now where we're in the far yellow, if you remember the demographic slides. Not the hugest part of the population right now. This is going to accelerate. So as we look beyond the short-term travails that we have in the state budget, which is, again, a revenue cap preventing us from keeping the money that we have, and then formulas on the spending side asking us to spend money that we don't have, we have a demographic shift that this system was not designed to pay for. Now, the good news is that this is the same problem in every state in the country, and it's also the same problem facing the Medicare program and Social Security. So it's going to be our societal obligation to work on these issues. It's not just the state of Colorado. But with all these other rules and constraints, this is going to be an added challenge. So as we look ahead, I hope I've conveyed, the so what is that things that we take for granted, subsidy for college tuition, support for transportation from the general fund. Patty mentioned, what are we going to do about I-70? The part of I-70 that I am the most worried about is the viaduct. I was a transportation commissioner, and we leave that thing outside all day, and people drive on it. It needs to be fixed, and without some sort of additional resource to transportation, that's going to be a serious challenge for the rest of the state's transportation budget. Sober minds will prevail, and resources will need to go to that project. That's just one example of some of these challenges that we're going to face. The good news is we're ahead of them. These will play out. There's probably at least a year and a half or two before these start to really get noticed. And our task, we feel, is to go out and say, are these working for you? Is this what you want from state government? Are these choices and allocations what you envisioned, and do they support the business climate that you want for the state? So I'm grateful to be included in this panel. It's quite an honor. Thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to your questions.
So I told you it was complicated. Can you imagine running your business where you have sort of a fixed amount of revenue, but you're committing to all these incremental expenses, and it's getting worse because you have an aging population and you've got these formulaic requirements that are out there. So we've had a few questions that have come in, and we do have microphones around the room so that if anybody is interested in asking a question of our three panelists, if you'll identify the folks with the microphones. But we had a couple questions that came in from the webcast participants. Here's the first one. Henry, given the state of our state budget, the system constraints, what are three things that Colorado residents should be thinking about to get behind to try to solve this problem? Because if we don't do something about it, it's going to have a dramatic impact on our economy and our businesses and our lives.
Thank you. So I think one thing about these formulas is, I think one thing people can do is come to talks like this and then multiply, the knowledge in the community about these issues. But I think one thing that's really struck me is when we look at these rules, I don't really see Democrats versus Republicans fighting in these rules. This is kind of a math-based system. It's built up over time with a lot of ideas that sounded good at one point, but then they play out in the Constitution. So I think one thing is to take a step back and understand that this is more formulas playing out than liberals versus conservatives. I think the other thing is if you know who your elected officials are at the state capitol, I think and I mean this in a positive political science way, the legislature will be as courageous as their constituents let them be. And I think we've had a lot of easy language around the budget, fraud, waste, and abuse, just make the cuts, it doesn't matter. We're not getting value for our dollar in schools. But I think that language is kind of easy when you actually go to your school and you see the class ratio, you see capital needs. I think telling your legislator that it's okay to work on these issues and it's okay to know that there's formulas, I think that would probably go a long way, because there are some things that can be done legislatively, still keep faith with the voters, but make this system a little more manageable. I don't really have a third one. I think I would just rinse and repeat on the first two.
Rinse and repeat, I like that. And I know Kelly and the Chamber are doing a lot to begin to analyze this issue and come up with some very tangible actions that we can take, because this does become a problem in this year and into the next year. Do we have a question over here? Is there a question in the back? We got another one as people are getting brave enough to raise their hands, and this one is for Patty. This is a challenge that will likely be in front of the legislature this year as well. Can you shed some light on the debate that multifamily home construction is concentrated on apartments versus condos? Deal with it relative to sort of the demand that's out there based upon the demographics we just heard versus the construction defect laws.
Sure. So in the chart that I had showed, that red bar that was looking at the multifamily construction, that does not reflect ownership versus renter at all. So in that particular data, it's just only based on the number of units that were being developed, okay? The big question is, for many of these higher density, as we have the boomers that are looking for these lower maintenance opportunities, the millennials that are trying to figure out, how do I get into that whole, how can I even start thinking about owning my own home? I need a stepping stone. That's when we start to look to the condominium, the townhouse market, so that there are ownership opportunities. Well, what we've seen in Colorado is that most of that red bar is going to be rental properties as opposed to ownership properties. And one of the things with fast tracks that we had hoped, that we had planned on, was that around these transit-oriented development stations that we would have ownership opportunities too. Our communities, renters are great, but in our communities we tend to see more community involvement and everything from those individuals that have an ownership position there. Due to the way the construction defects legislation has been written, it is very challenging to get those ownership buildings constructed right now. So there's fear from the developers of getting sued and that they won't be able to be given the opportunity to effectively minimize any type of issue. So, all this legislation is it's not that we are trying to promote shoddy construction. That is not it whatsoever. We want people in the community to have that recourse. But we also need to make sure that there are arbitration measures, that in the condominiums that people have truly gotten to have a majority vote in terms of whether or not they want to pursue some type of legal action against developers or that type of thing. So anyway, the whole bottom line is what we're seeing in Colorado right now is our system is such that it is very challenging for developers to build those new condominium units. Insurance costs are outrageous. Financing costs are very challenging. So we would like to see some changes in that law to encourage more ownership, higher density opportunities out in our marketplace.
Elizabeth, could I ask you to address that as well? As you look at these demographic projections, will at some point this next generation, whatever it's called, change their habits and move away from this apartment market? How do you see demand changing based upon demographic projections?
It's really hard, obviously. We reached a peak in 2010 where it was a bad time in terms of our economy. And so getting into ownership was incredibly challenging, especially for the youngest age groups, because they were the worst hit by the recession. And again, millennials are right now between the ages of 15 and 35. So they're also at that youngest age group, and most of them are still, allowed to be in parents' basements. So they're moving in, and everybody's taking longer to do everything that they've ever thought about doing, whether it's getting married, having kids. And so not really until that generation starts really getting into whether it's marriage or partnership and kids, then you start seeing the demand switch to potentially to ownership. But they've also got to have a job, and they have to have a time period that they've had a job. we see the demand for ownership increasing into the future, and I think it's vital for our economy. If they aren't involved in asset accumulation at a young age, where will they be at 45, at 55? And so I worry about that concept that people may not ever get back into ownership, but if you look at your own wealth and your client's wealth, what is the biggest part of that? And it tends to be real estate. So that is one of my biggest concerns of that group right now, is looking at where will they go and what will they get into. But definitely smaller. You know, if you are in the McMansion market, we've got enough. That is not something that I see a demand for more McMansions. But, you know, those smaller single-family homes I see demand for.
Interesting information. Anybody else have a question from the audience? I still have some from the webcast, but yes.
Yes. Okay.
There you go.
Oh, here we go. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel. I think you guys have done a wonderful job. And my question is for Henry. And I know you had to expect this question, but I really would like to know your thoughts on oil prices. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but if you can maybe elaborate a little bit on your thoughts.
So oil prices, and we love to make economist forecast jokes. I think that at a top level, there is a lot of compensating benefit to what will happen probably with a pullback in oil and gas development in Colorado. We've been talking to some executives in the industry, and to the, you know, they can't exactly say exactly what they're doing because they're constrained. But it is reasonable to expect a pullback from the trajectory that they had been on in terms of new investment, new rigs. And we're mindful of that because a dollar spent in that industry pays out a much different multiplier than in other industries. But Colorado's economy is not just an oil and gas economy. This is different than 30 years ago. Our diversification is just, it's a completely different place. And so even a substantial pullback, as Patty indicated, would still mean that we would probably still gain jobs in Colorado for a year. And then you add up all the compensating benefit to households and businesses that will have money freed up from lower oil prices and gas prices. So on net, it's probably a little bit down, but just in that sector. And I think the total state economy will continue to grow. It's not to diminish the impacts on those communities or those people. Where we're really trying to spend a bunch of time is read these tea leaves of how long will this go. Even for the Saudi Arabian government, oil is 90% of their budget. And so how much do they have in the bank to try to take people out if that's actually what's going on in this big game of risk? So I think right now the projection is later in 2015 in the fall, prices go back up. And that's kind of the working theory right now.
I do think it's interesting, and I'll shout out to Kelly Bruff again from the Chamber. If anyone wants to follow up on this topic, I know they're really looking at it. She wrote an email the other day that said of the 50 states, I think, Kelly, in the U.S., there are 8 states that will be impacted negatively by the oil and gas decline in price. And Colorado is one of those 8 states just because we have such a concentration here, even though it's less. They're also doing analysis on what's the break-even point for delivering a barrel of oil, and it changes across the state and the basins all across the country. And I think Colorado is well poised there. But just to exacerbate this whole budget discussion is severance tax, which is a big part of what's helping drive our state budget and local economies, could also be impacted by this. And I know this is a priority for the Chamber and their leadership in helping us understand what does this mean for Colorado, I think is really key. So check on the Chamber, become a member if you haven't, because I think the quality of work they're doing in this space is really critical, I think, to all of us. Other questions in the back?
Good morning, Mr. Alexander. Thank you for the wonderful breakfast, and thank you, panel, for your expertise. My name is Steve Farland. I'm a business owner. We began a business in 1990 as an entrepreneurial desire to excel and try to raise a family. And it was at that point when the economy was just coming out of the 80s and you couldn't find a job. You couldn't find anywhere to live because you couldn't afford to live there. And I've watched this growth, and it feels suspiciously like the beginning of the 90s again, where there's a big wave and there's a lot of growth and a lot of business. Our business is a hospitality business. We sell and build furniture for restaurants. And I'm wondering what the growth projections are for the hospitality industry, and where does it line up in the picture of employment in this state, future and present? Thank you.
Patty, you want to take that first?
Sure. So in terms of the whole hospitality industry, so our leisure and hospitality sector in the Metro Denver region is expected to continue to grow in 2015 and a little bit beyond. I think that we're seeing improvements in terms of tourism activity in the state of Colorado, which certainly benefits our businesses that are located here in the Metro Denver region as well. So this brings up the point that our economic forecast is being released tomorrow, a full report that goes into the description of all of the different industry groups. And I have to say, I can't remember exactly what the growth rate is that I have slated for that leisure and hospitality industry, but I do know that it is expanding. I think as we look forward too, I mean, again, the whole idea that the different generational shifts that we're experiencing are indeed shifting to those spending patterns. So as Elizabeth had mentioned, the boomers are spending more of their dollars on restaurants and travel and that type of thing, versus perhaps some of the younger generational groups are not quite are still being very frugal in terms of their spending. So I would think that a lot of the attraction in that industry is going to generally be coming from the business travelers as well as the older generational groups.
Elizabeth, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention, is that just keep an eye on the demographics. So we definitely see that growth in the 65 plus. So looking at leisure hospitality targeted at that age group. Not so much at the 45 to 64-year-olds, because that's not where we're seeing a lot of the growth in the future, but then also at the lower end, so a younger end. So looking at leisure hospitality targeted at the younger end, and as Patty mentioned, that's going to be a different type, and then looking at that 65 plus. And remember that 65 plus is different than any other 65 plus we've had, because they're boomers. They've been very, very active. They're the ones that created that adventure tourism, and now they're going to be looking at that low impact adventure tourism. So there's a huge market out there, and I think it's just really important to know what your segment is.
Low impact, I like that. We have regular forums with our customers across the state and ask them what's on their mind, and a lot of them are coming to this point of saying, we need to reinvent ourselves, as I said earlier, but we need to continue to segment and sub-segment our target customers as well as employees in order to be effective going forward. I have another question that came in from the webcast for Henry. So they're a little confused about the budget. So the question is, as you see this required increase in K-12, as you see the impact of demographics requiring more investment in Medicaid, perhaps a reduction in severance tax and other resources, and now, because of the cap, we have to give money back to the taxpayer. So far, that seems like strike three to me, but can you expound on what the impact that has on the state construction budget? And if you look at a project like I-70 corridor just over here, does that mean we won't have the money to fund these kinds of things? What happens?
That's a great question. So from our pie slice, capital construction is something the state does, either through building state buildings, maintaining state buildings, or in certain cases, there is a statute that allows general fund money to go to transportation. Most of transportation is user fee, the registration fees you pay, the gas tax you pay, federal funds that come back to the state. So the impact on the budget is on the margin. So yes, the transportation budget will remain kind of where it is. We're not allowed to use the taxes and fees in transportation for the TABOR rebate. Remember, they're in the orange. The Constitution actually protects that slice. It's the extra money that won't be able to be given to transportation that pays for these big one-off projects like the viaduct. And so, is the answer no, it will never happen? That's not a good prediction. The point is that these constraints are now going to probably crowd out things like that unless something changes, because no one expects public safety to be compromised to balance the budget. We will, have to comply with when new Medicaid people show up. Similarly, we're trying very hard to keep that negative factor from growing. So I would say that it's less a calamity absent a recession. Rather, this extra on the margin with resources that we currently have. Now, I will say, this dynamic that we're playing out, we're going to have more money going to K-12 than is available for the whole budget. That's in a growth scenario. So if a flat budget, a stock market hiccup, even a downturn, and the growth formula and the biggest pie slice continues, that's where you start to see things getting Pac-Maned away.
Got to pay attention to our economy and our state budget. We have time for one more question from the audience. Anybody else have one last question? Okay, our speakers will stay up here afterwards. If anybody wasn't brave enough to ask a question, I'm sure they'd be delighted to chat with you about it. Would you please help me thank our great speakers today, Elizabeth, Patty, and Henry. I think they did a great job. And for anybody who discounts the level of impact and intellect of government officials, I think these guys prove that they make a huge contribution to our state. Vectra wants to thank you for being here today. Those of you who are customers, we truly appreciate your business. Those of you who are not yet customers, we look forward to changing that. Have a wonderful 2015. Please let us know what else we can do to improve this event in the future. Thank you very much.